Dred Scott was born into slavery in 1799 in Southampton County, Virginia. In 1831, Scott was sold to John Emerson in Missouri. Emerson was a surgeon for the U.S. military and took Scott to various states throughout the U.S. where he was assigned. Emerson took Scott to various free territories such as Minnesota, Illinois, and Wisconsin for a total of 7 years. In 1846, Emerson died, leaving Scott to his widow, Mrs. Emerson. Scott then tried to sue Mrs. Emerson in Missouri courts for his freedom, claiming that he was no longer a slave after living in free territories for an extended amount of time. In 1850, the circuit court where Emerson filed the suit declared him free, but this decision was reversed by the Missouri Supreme Court. After 11 years of cases in the Missouri courts, the case reached the U.S. Supreme Court. At this point, John Sanford, brother of Mrs. Emerson, had taken over the case, claiming ownership of Scott. Sanford and his attorneys argued Scott could not sue because he was not a citizen, rather he was private property. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney was the judge for this case. He was a former slave owner from Maryland and a staunch supporter of slavery. On March 6, 1857, Roger B. Taney in the Supreme Court declared Scott could not sue under the federal court because he was not a citizen. Taney declared that blacks were not and could not ever become citizens of the U.S. Taney argued blacks had virtually no rights under the Constitution, including the right to sue under federal courts because slaves were property, and the Fifth Amendment prohibited Congress from taking property without due process of the law. The Dred Scott decision also declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional on the basis that the federal government had no right to prohibit slavery in the states. This was a highly controversial decision. It convinced the North that the government was dominated by slaveholders. This event could be considered a social cause of the Civil War because it affected the status of all African Americans in the U.S. It established slaves as property rather than citizens and was a major step backward for the anti-slavery movement. It ignored the fact that black men in 5 of the original states had been full voting citizens ever since the Declaration of Independence. This fueled anger throughout the North. It could also be considered a political cause of the war, as it divided the Democratic Party into Northern and Southern factions and strengthened the Republican Party, which partially led to Lincoln's election, in turn pushing the South to secession. It once again highlighted differences in political ideology between the North and the South. The North was outraged that slavery was once again open to expansion and believed the decision was a result of a slave power conspiracy in the Supreme Court. Abraham Lincoln stated, "We think the Dred Scott decision is erroneous. We know the court that made it has often overruled its own decisions, and we shall do what we can to have it overrule this." The South celebrated the decision and viewed it as the ultimate vindication of slavery, as well as the answer to the slavery question. A Southern newspaper said of the decision, "A prize for which the athletes of the nation have often wrestled in the halls of Congress has been awarded at last, by the proper umpire, to those who have justly won it." The Dred Scott decision brought the issue of slavery to the entire nation and increased tensions between the North and South, which eventually led to the Civil War.